They went from living like kings to dying with nothing. Once surrounded by Rolls-Royces, designer suits, and sprawling mansions, their fame and fortune vanished overnight. Grammy Awards collected dust, bank accounts ran dry, and the glory they preached about slipped away. Today, we're counting down 10 black pastors who died in poverty. And trust me, these stories will shake your faith in everything you thought you knew about success, power, and divine destiny. Let's begin with the first name, a man who preached prosperity, lived like royalty, but died buried in debt and regret. Reverend Frederick J. Untold II. Reverend Frederick J. Untold II, better known as Reverend Ike, was no ordinary preacher. He shocked America by preaching something few ministers dare to say. God wants you to be rich. And for a time, he lived that message in full color. In the 1970s and 80s, Reverend Ike became the undisputed king of the prosperity gospel, long before that term even existed. He wasn't your typical man of the cloth. He cruised through Harlem in Rolls-Royces, dressed in tailor-made suits that cost more than a year's salary for most of his followers, and lived in mansions that looked like temples of luxury. He didn't just talk about prosperity, he performed it. His sermons were broadcast on television. His mail-order ministry reached millions, and his New York headquarters buzzed like a spiritual version of Wall Street. People all over the world mailed him their hard-earned money, believing his promise that by giving to his ministry, God would bless them in return. But that river of cash didn't go unnoticed. By the late 1980s, the IRS and the U.S. Postal Service began to circle. When those two show up, you know the party's over. Investigators wanted to know where the millions were really going. And what they found painted a troubling picture: lavish spending, blurred lines between personal pleasure and ministry funds, and questionable bookkeeping that raised more than a few eyebrows. The very man who condemned poverty as a sin soon found himself drowning in debt and legal troubles. The empire he'd built on faith and fortune began to crumble. Court fees, taxes, and penalties stripped away the wealth that had once made him a symbol of divine success. When Reverend Ike passed away in 2009, the man who once preached that "you can't lose with the stuff I use" left behind a financial mess so tangled it took years for his family to untangle. His Rolls-Royces were gone, his mansions empty, and his empire reduced to dust. The gospel of wealth that made him famous became the very thing that destroyed him. A cautionary tale of faith, fortune, and the price of preaching prosperity. Reverend James Cleveland, the king who built a gospel empire and lost it all. Reverend James Cleveland wasn't just a preacher, he was a movement. Known as the king of gospel music, he didn't only speak the word, he sang it straight into the souls of millions. His voice had a power that could make the toughest hearts tremble, and his music transformed church hymns into performances worthy of the world's biggest stages, even Madison Square Garden. Cleveland founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, an institution that still shapes gospel artists today. With over 100 albums, multiple Grammy Awards, and collaborations with icons like Aretha Franklin, he redefined what gospel could be. When Reverend Cleveland entered a room, you felt it, the kind of presence that silenced noise and demanded reverence. But behind the praise and platinum records lay a truth more painful than any song he ever sang. After his death in 1991, his multi-million-dollar estate should have been a blessing to his loved ones. Instead, it became a battlefield. The moment the news broke, claimants appeared from every corner. People declaring they were his children, others insisting they shared a special bond that entitled them to his wealth. What should have been a season of mourning turned into a legal war. The real blow, however, wasn't financial, it was personal. A foster son came forward with accusations of sexual abuse, claims that shattered the gospel world and led to costly settlements. The lawsuits piled up. Lawyers drained the accounts. Family members fought bitterly over what remained. By the time the dust settled, the man who once built a gospel empire had left behind little more than chaos. The king of gospel music, who had filled arenas, inspired nations, and moved millions, died leaving an empire in ruins and an inheritance devoured by scandal and greed. His story stands as a haunting reminder. Even the most divine voices can be drowned out by the noise of human flaws. Bishop Gilbert A. Patterson, The Rise and Burden of a Church Empire. Bishop Gilbert A. Patterson wasn't just a preacher, he was a force. A visionary who transformed the Church of God in Christ into a spiritual powerhouse. From a modest congregation, he built Temple of Deliverance into a national ministry that touched thousands of lives. Under his leadership, the church didn't just grow, it exploded. Crowds traveled across state lines just to sit under his voice. His sermons, broadcast on radio and television, filled homes across America with hope and conviction. But behind the pulpit's glow stood a man who understood that faith alone couldn't move mountains, not in the modern world. Bishop Patterson was a strategist. He built infrastructure, invested in technology, and turned faith into a living, breathing institution. To him, ministry wasn't only about preaching, it was about building something that would last for generations. Yet, every empire has its cracks. After his passing, reports surfaced of debts and financial disputes surrounding his estate. How could a ministry so successful fall into such turmoil? The answer lies in the cost of greatness. Television airtime, massive facilities, staff, equipment. Every expansion came with a price. Growth that rapid often demands more than faith. It demands finances. And sometimes, even the most visionary leaders push too far, too fast. Maybe Patterson's ambition outpaced the church's resources. Maybe decisions made in trust went wrong behind the scenes. Whatever the cause, the fact remains. The man who built one of Memphis's most powerful ministries may have left behind a financial storm few expected. His legacy still shines, but beneath the glory lies a sobering truth that even spiritual giants can stand on fragile ground. Reverend Solomon Burke. Reverend Solomon Burke wasn't just a man, he was a movement. A preacher by day and a soul singer by night. He lived two lives that somehow harmonized into one extraordinary legacy. When he stood behind the pulpit, his sermons could bring entire congregations to tears. And when he stepped onto the stage, that same voice turned into pure fire, raw, emotional, and unforgettable. They called him the King of Rock and Soul, a title he wore with both pride and humility. For Burke, there was never a conflict between faith and music. He believed both were sacred, both were ministry. Whether he was singing Cry to Me or Everybody Needs Somebody to Love, he wasn't just performing. He was preaching through melody, connecting hearts across every line and note. But behind the applause, there was a harsher truth. The music industry of the 1960s and 70s was a cruel game, especially for black artists. Record labels got rich, while the creators, the very soul of the sound, were left with crumbs. Burke, despite his towering influence, fell victim to that same system. There were times when a man who once filled concert halls and graced radios around the world had nowhere to sleep. He hustled hard, launching funeral homes, restaurants, and other ventures to keep his family afloat. Some thrived, others failed. But through every setback, Burke never stopped preaching, never stopped singing. His faith was unshakable, his spirit unstoppable. Then came the Renaissance. Younger generations rediscovered his music, and legends who once idolized him, from the Rolling Stones to Bruce Springsteen, publicly honored his genius. A Grammy finally came his way, but decades of exploitation and mismanagement had already taken their toll. When Solomon Burke passed in 2010, he left behind more than just songs. He left a spiritual legacy that shaped American music forever. The tragedy wasn't that he died with little money. It was that a man who gave the world so much soul never truly got what he deserved in return. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. wasn't just a preacher. He was a force of nature, a man who refused to stay in his lane. And because of that, America was changed forever. As the pastor of Harlem's historic Abyssinian Baptist Church, Powell could have limited his work to Sunday sermons. Instead, He took the pulpit to the streets and into the halls of power, becoming one of the most influential and controversial politicians of his time. Elected to Congress in 1945, when black voices in Washington were almost non-existent, Powell didn't go there to be quiet or to play by anyone's rules. He challenged the system head-on, pushing for civil rights, battling segregation, and demanding justice for the people of Harlem and beyond. He didn't just talk about equality, he made it his mission, and he did it all with undeniable style. Powell drove luxury cars, wore sharp suits, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his worth. Critics called him extravagant, even unholy for a man of God. But Powell never apologized. To him, success was resistance. He believed that black leaders should embody pride, power, and presence, that dignity was not something to ask for, but something to claim. As chairman of the powerful House Education and Labor Committee, Powell helped pass groundbreaking civil rights legislation that shaped modern America. Yet, as his influence grew, so did his enemies. His lavish lifestyle and complicated finances became ammunition for his detractors. Accusations flew, misuse of public funds, personal trips billed to taxpayers, blurred lines between his public duty and private life. Whether driven by truth or the deep racism of his era, those allegations eventually brought him down. Congress censured him. He lost his chairmanship, then his seat altogether. The man who once held the political spotlight now stood in the shadows. By the time he died in 1972, his fortune was gone, his reputation battered, and he was living in near poverty in the Bahamas, far from the Harlem streets that had once chanted his name. But even in death, Adam Clayton Powell Jr.'s legacy refuses to fade. He was bold, flawed, brilliant, and unafraid. A man who dared to demand equality in a world that told him to wait his turn. And because he didn't, the nation moved one step closer to justice. Reverend C.L. Franklin, the man with the million-dollar voice. Before Aretha Franklin became the undisputed queen of soul, her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, was already a legend in his own right, a preacher whose voice could stir hearts and move mountains. They called him the man with the million-dollar voice, and for good reason. His sermons weren't just spoken, they were performed. Each message flowed like a symphony, filled with rhythm, emotion, and crescendos that could lift an entire congregation to its feet. When Reverend Franklin preached, people didn't just listen, they felt. His masterpiece, "The Eagle Stirreth Her Nest," still echoes through time as one of the most powerful orations in American history. But behind the pulpit, CL was more than a preacher. He was a visionary, a savvy businessman, a civil rights leader, and a man unafraid to use his voice for justice. He marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., led rallies for equality, and turned his new Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit into a spiritual and political powerhouse. At home, he recognized the spark in his young daughter, Aretha. He nurtured it, guided her, and opened the doors that would one day make her a global icon. Through him, she learned not just the sound of gospel, but the soul of it. Then, tragedy struck. On June 10th, 1979, Reverend Franklin's life changed forever when two men broke into his home and shot him during what was believed to be a robbery. He slipped into a coma that lasted 5 long years. Years filled with medical bills, round-the-clock care, and mounting financial chaos. The man who had once filled churches and auditoriums with his powerful voice was now silent, and his once thriving income was gone. When he passed away in 1984, much of his fortune had been consumed by the cost of keeping him alive and the legal complications that followed. Disputes over his estate and financial legacy cast a long shadow over what should have been a story of triumph. Reverend C.L. Franklin, the man whose words once inspired a generation, left this world with far less than he gave it. Yet his legacy lives on, not in riches, but in the rhythm of every soul he ever touched, and in the timeless voice of his daughter, who carried his spirit to the world. Reverend Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad wasn't just a preacher. He was a visionary who reshaped the course of Black America. From 1934 until his death in 1975, he led the Nation of Islam and turned it into one of the most powerful black nationalist movements in American history. Under his leadership, the organization grew beyond faith. It became an empire, a network of farms, schools, grocery stores, restaurants, and businesses that gave jobs, dignity, and purpose to thousands of black men and women across the country. Muhammad's message was simple but revolutionary: black self-reliance and economic independence. And he lived by it. He taught his followers that power didn't come from protest alone, it came from ownership, from discipline, from unity. The Nation of Islam became a model of black excellence: sharp suits, clean living, strong families, and thriving businesses. But behind the order and prosperity, storms brewed. Elijah Muhammad's teachings often clashed with mainstream Islam and American society. At a time when the civil rights movement was pushing for integration, he preached separation, a message that drew both admiration and fear. The FBI kept close watch, labeling him a dangerous influence. The greatest turmoil, however, came from within. His most devoted follower, Malcolm X, broke away, accusing Muhammad of hypocrisy and moral failings. The split tore through the movement and ended in blood. Malcolm X's assassination in 1965 left scars that never healed, and questions that still echo through history. When Elijah Muhammad passed in 1975, the Nation of Islam was worth millions. Yet what followed was chaos. A court revealed that much of the wealth people believed belonged to the movement was actually part of Muhammad's personal estate. Suddenly, the man who had preached selflessness was accused of enriching himself through faith. The verdict split families, drained bank accounts, and shattered trust. Legal battles dragged on for years, consuming the fortune he had built. By the time the dust settled, much of the wealth and unity was gone. In the end, Elijah Muhammad left behind a complicated legacy. A man who built an empire from nothing, lifted countless lives, and taught a generation the power of self-determination, yet died with his movement divided and his fortune in ruins. Reverend George Washington Woodbey. Reverend George Washington Woodbey was a man who refused to be boxed in, and that refusal to conform may have cost him everything. Born into slavery, he rose to become not only a preacher, but one of the most fearless black socialist leaders in American history. His vision was bold, even dangerous for his time, a fusion of Christianity and socialism that challenged the very foundations of early 20th century America. Woodbey believed that Jesus Christ was the first true socialist, a revolutionary who fought for justice and equality. To him, faith without economic fairness was hypocrisy. But in an era when capitalism and Christianity walked hand in hand, such words were heresy. Still, Woodbey didn't preach for approval. He preached for truth. From pulpits to political stages, his voice thundered with conviction. He wrote books, delivered fiery speeches, and even ran for political office, becoming the Socialist Party's vice presidential nominee in 1908. It was a groundbreaking moment, making him one of the first black Americans to be nominated for such a high position. But that courage came at a heavy cost. White America saw him as a dangerous agitator. Many in the black community feared his socialist ideals would damage the broader fight for civil rights. His race made him suspect. His politics made him untouchable. Venues closed their doors. Publishers ignored him. Donations were scarce. He spent his life fighting for economic justice while living in poverty himself. The man who dreamed of equality for all struggled to afford his own survival. When he died, it was said he left this world nearly penniless, a tragic irony for a man who had given everything to the cause of justice. Yet, time would prove him right. His ideas, once dismissed as radical, would go on to inspire generations of activists, theologians, and freedom fighters. Reverend George Washington Woodbey was not just ahead of his time. He was a man standing in tomorrow, shouting truth into a world that wasn't ready to listen. Reverend Henry McNeil Turner. Reverend Henry McNeil Turner wasn't just a man of God. He was a force that redefined what it meant to be black and free in America. A bishop, a politician, a journalist, and, above all, a visionary, Turner helped shape both the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the very foundation of black nationalism. He dared to imagine a world where his people didn't just survive. They led, they built, and they thrived. Born free in South Carolina in 1834, a rarity for black Americans of that time, Turner carved his destiny through sheer intellect and will. Mostly self-taught, he mastered languages, studied law and theology, and became a thunderous orator who could electrify a crowd with a single word. When the Civil War erupted, he broke barriers as one of the first black chaplains in the U.S. Army, ministering to Union soldiers who fought not just for victory, but for their very humanity. After the war, Turner carried that same fire into politics. Elected to the Georgia State Legislature during Reconstruction, he became a fierce advocate for the rights of newly freed slaves. But when white Democrats stole back control and expelled black legislators, Turner refused to be silent. His voice rose above fear, calling out the betrayal of America's promises of equality. As a bishop in the AME Church, Turner became the architect of a spiritual empire, planting churches across the South and sending missionaries to Africa. He envisioned the church not just as a sanctuary, but as a bridge connecting people of African descent across oceans and continents. Yet, his boldest belief, and the one that made him both celebrated and condemned, was his conviction that true liberation might only be found in Africa. Turner believed America's racism ran too deep, too poisonous, for black people ever to find full dignity on its soil. He urged his people to reclaim the land of their ancestors, to build nations, write their own laws, and rise beyond the reach of white supremacy. Supporters hailed him as a prophet ahead of his time. Critics accused him of giving up on America. But Turner didn't care. He was a man possessed by vision, a preacher of destiny, not comfort. He spent his final years traveling relentlessly, preaching, organizing, and spreading his message of self-determination. In 1915, while on church business in Canada, Turner's extraordinary journey came to an end. No one knows exactly how wealthy he was when he died. The records are unclear, but perhaps that's the point. Turner never chased money. He built legacies. His wealth was measured in institutions, in movements, in the minds he set ablaze. His influence lived on through leaders like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, and through every AME church still standing strong today. Reverend Henry McNeil Turner may have left this world over a century ago, but his vision of pride, power, and purpose still echoes, as loud and as urgent as ever. And if you thought that story was powerful, hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next will shake you even more.